Yeah.
We'll see. In the meantime, the House and the Senate are looking for a budget compromise that would avert a government shutdown. Joining us right now with more on this is House Majority Leader Eric Cantor. And Leader Cantor, thank you very much for coming in today.
Good morning. It's great to be here.
It's great to see you. We always love having you on set with us. And this is a really important time. We're getting down, and it sounds like the two sides could potentially reach a compromise. How optimistic are you feeling right now?
You know, Liz, I think where we should be in terms of driving forward is both sides should say right away, no one is for shutting down the government. We're just for trying to start to cut spending here. And that's really where the House has been all along. As you know, we've been through several bills coming across the House floor to avoid a government shutdown while cutting spending. You know, where we are now is the Senate is poised this week to take up the House bill, which is the $100 billion off of the 011 amount, as well as trying to take up the bill that they are proffering, which is to cut $10 billion off of the 011 amount.
Which still shows you how much distance there is between the two sides. Do you believe that this is something, because even though we've gotten some relief and some extension on this, the deadline's coming up in less than a week and a half?
Yeah, I mean, we've got, again, Becky, in the way the calendars work, you do have almost a week and a half to get things straight. And so, again, we want to avoid a government shutdown. But let's step back a second and really, you know, focus on the real challenge for us. I mean, we're spending money we don't have, and we got a real choice to make in this country. And that is, are we going to continue to have spending both at the discretionary and the mandatory levels at their current state, or are we going to try and reform it all? And that's what the public's looking for. The public's looking to see that we're actually going to change the way that Washington's doing business so that we can get back to the sort of opportunity-driven society that we are. Otherwise, we're going to be living under this crushing debt load that is not only going to affect our kids, it'll affect us today. And that's really the choice we've got before us. Which one do we want?
I know it's far too simplistic, but to say, look, we come out of this in the middle, somewhere between 55 and 60 billion in cuts, would that be something that you'd be satisfied with, or would you rather see the government shut down over a disparity like that?
Listen, nobody wants to shut down a government. I mean, we need to drive forward, and the president himself continues to say that he wants to work with us. The problem is there's been no credible plan put in place that he's proffered. I mean, where he is, his vision of how we get through this fiscal year, much less how we're going to deal with the much larger and impactful issues, which are entitlements. We all know that.
Right. Obviously, that's the big issue that still has yet to be tackled, that is going to be there, sitting there in the face, no matter what happens in the next couple of weeks. The big question, though, also comes down to what this would do to the economy right now. And I know Mark Zandi has put out some ideas where he thinks it would cut 600,000 to 700,000 jobs. You have kind of come right at him on that. Where do you think the differences lie in these?
Well, first of all, you know, hiring people that you can't afford to pay is not really a good policy. But second of all, if government spending was the key, then we would have seen a stimulus bill that was wildly successful. Let's just crank up the government spending and borrowing and put everybody back to work. I mean, that's what that theory says to me, and we've already seen that's failed miserably. And now we're left with this incredible debt load that we're going to have to do something about quickly. So what we're trying to say is, let's make the choice. Let's go about trying to say we don't want to be a government-centered kind of country where people are reliant and dependent upon the government. We know what's made America what it is. It is the risk-based investment of entrepreneurs. So we're trying to put forward a plan, and you'll see within a month's time a Republican House budget, which will actually speak to entitlement reform. We're going to put it all out there. And the president failed to do that. I'm hopeful that they'll come meet us on that.
You know, Wilbur, last week we spoke with Warren Buffett, who said he really sees private industry, at least at the point where they're going to be hiring more people. He said he was surprised by how few people Berkshire Hathaway hired last year, but he said they're at the point where you're going to have to hire more people to get more. Are you seeing similar things in your businesses?
Yeah, as the economy gradually improves, people will start to hire, but I think unless the growth is well over 3%, it's not going to materially change employment. And I think people shouldn't be focusing on unemployment percentages because too many games are in that.
Because too many people have fallen out of the workforce.
Yeah, the real question is how many people are working, and especially how many jobs private sector is creating. And as to Mark Sandel's comment, remember, he felt that the Obama stimulus package would solve the unemployment problem. So this is just him continuing the same theory that proved not so correct when they were putting the big stimulus in.
Eric, who do you talk to now on either on the other side in the House or in the Obama administration? Who is more amenable now after this wonderful tack to the center, where all your ideas are welcome now? Who do you talk to?
Let's just discount that a little bit.
Is there anybody?
Yeah, I actually have talked yesterday and talked fairly frequently with Bill Daley, the President's Chief of Staff. I've said before, I've talked to him more than I talked to Rahm Emanuel the entire year and a half or so that Rahm was there. And I had a relationship with Rahm. So I view that as a positive. I mean, Bill Daley's reached out. I do have a working relationship with several folks on the other side of the aisle, Steny Hoyer for sure. And I do think that Steny's always been one to say he wants to work with us to cut spending and to work for entitlement reform. And listen, if we're going to get anything done, now's the time when we've got, a Democratic president, Senate, Republican-led House. We can actually do some things on entitlement, but we've not seen any sort of specifics from them. Our side will put out, as you know, our Budget Committee and Chairman Paul Ryan is going to put out a budget within a month, and it'll speak to how we see entitlements going. And we're going to say, look, we're going to protect the current retirees and those nearing retirement, but for the rest of us, those 54 and under, we've got to come to grips with the fact that we're going to have these programs around. They're going to look a lot different.
Do you think that the Republican governors are overplaying their hand in terms of Wisconsin or Ohio? You've seen some of the public opinion polls conducted by the New York Times or by, NBC, Wall Street Journal. Are they on the right track in Wisconsin, or is it going to backfire? I mean, the Republicans are going to be seeing events, I guess, as cut, austerity, 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 take away union rights. I mean, you can be painted into a corner, and 2010 could be history, and 2012 could be another snapback to.
Well, one of the things, to your latter point about cut, and we've been about cut and grow. And I think what you're going to see is Dave Camp and the Ways and Means Committee has already launched hearings for tax reform. We're going to be in pursuit of a free trade agenda, once again, to help our exporters. We're going to try and provide an environment for entrepreneurial growth. And that's very much what we're about. If you look at what's going on in the state capitals right now, what's gone wrong is there's been a lot of abuse in terms of, some of the government worker unions taking advantage of their collective bargaining powers.
But you know what? The polls seem to indicate that people understand that there are budget problems and that there's a need for austerity. The question becomes, if the unions are willing to negotiate on those points and you still insist on taking away collective bargaining for these public unions, is that a step too far? That may be the tipping point for swing voters.
I do think that, the point that Governor Walker is trying to make is the collective bargaining rights that have been given to the government worker unions have allowed them not only to increase wages, but now we know its benefits. And what that's done, I think, to people that I talk to is it's begun to wake them up. And they're seeing now that benefits especially far exceed those in the private sector. I mean, that is for the government.
Yeah, I've seen that from the USA Today study, but I've also seen people argue against that, which confuses me again. I guess part of it is they don't take education levels into account for that, and some of these government workers have a higher education level.
But the fact is, I think that a lot of people, and look at Chris Christie in New Jersey. I mean, he's come to the point where he says, look, the rest of New Jersey is propping up this incestuous relationship that exists between government workers and government worker unions and politicians. And one helps the other, and the rest of the people pay for it. And that's sort of what's going on in Wisconsin right now, too. And certainly the rhetoric has gotten to a point where I think most Americans say, hey, just figure this thing out. But the crux of it is there's been a imbalance, if you will, in terms of power, and the government worker unions have made it very difficult, I'm told, from municipalities in this state of Wisconsin to even operate, because again, it comes down to the math. It is all about the fact you don't have the money anymore. And I think, and I'm hopeful that what folks will take from our discussions in Washington is we're serious about coming off of a strict ideological play and say it's about the math here. Let's go about balancing the budget. Let's get us back into a fiscally prudent lane so we can grow again.
But again, I think that's a message that resonates more than necessarily taking that next step. I think that's where some of these polls are picking up on a little indecision.
Right, and again, the tit for tat that's going on now in the very highly charged environment is something that's beginning, I think, to affect, perhaps depending on what the poll is, how the poll is designed.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, really in this country, it's about everybody having a fair shot. And it's the private sector, employers and employees thinking they don't have a fair shot because there's something going on with their politicians and the government worker unions. People are feeling still that fraudulent mortgage actors have now caused their home values to be depressed, and they can't see that come back. There's people looking at the gyrations on Wall Street thinking, hey, wait a minute, what about my 401k? And so what we're going to be about in Washington is to try and say, you've got now a majority in Congress, in the House, that's listening, that wants to go about evening the playing field, to give everybody that fair shot so we can restore the sort of aspirational sense that this country was built upon.
But there's still a belief that the hunger for cuts come from a relatively small vocal group, right, that are represented by Tea Party congressmen in the House. And that if you look at the polls that Joe mentioned, the polls will say, what do you think is the best idea for reducing the deficit? The top choice is always raise taxes on the rich, and the bottom choices are cut K through 12, Medicare, Medicaid. Are you ready to have that conversation before doesn't that spell challenges for 2012?
There's no question. I mean, all of us want this economy to come back and get people back to work. And what our message is we want to rebalance, if you will, the relationship between government and the private sector. I think most people would say government's grown entirely too big. And what we need to do is to lay out the problem. And the problem is, if we continue on the current path, government will be too big. And we're having a discussion now about what is a proper role of government. And that really, I think, if we engage the public, they'll begin to understand what sets America apart. And what sets America apart is you don't have a government that's picking winners and losers. More than anywhere else in the world, this is a place where entrepreneurs, no matter where they come from, no matter what school they went to or who they know, can actually make something of themselves. We've got to empower people again to have that sense of aspiration in this country. And it starts with a government that actually conducts itself the way the people conduct their own affairs.
We started at the top talking about Libya, and I saw you listening. Aren't there really big cuts that are ripe for the taking, either not growing the military, a la a Libya no-fly zone, but certainly in Afghanistan? I mean, are there bold decisions there that the Congress and the White House could make?
Right now, I think, people are really in the region as well as here, not really sure where our administration stands on Libya. I do think that, we've got certainly some things that are already put in place, whether they're asset freezes, sanctions, and the rest. But we've got to focus on the real core of the threat in that region. That is the spread of radical Islam. And the actors that are continuing to fund instability come out of Tehran. And obviously, we have American troops in Afghanistan, Iraq. We should be very focused on making sure the mission is valid, and we're executing on the mission in both of those countries, given the changes that have taken place in the region. And we also need to be focused very, very strongly on Saudi Arabia. As we know, they have been a pillar of our national security policy. And I'm also fearful of their vulnerability, as well as what happens in Egypt. These are things already that I think are hugely important to national security interests for the United States there. So there are some bold decisions we need to make. As you've seen Secretary Gates say all the time, the Pentagon's got to learn how to effectively deploy its capital as well, which is taxpayer money.
How big a priority is repealing health care?
It's a big priority.
Still going to be.
Yes, and Joe, that we started the debate when it came to health care reform centered on cost, because employers were saying we can't afford this anymore, and the government, we know the government will not be able to afford the trajectory that we're on. Unfortunately, when the health care bill was passed, we had moved away from reducing cost and much more emphasizing coverage without doing what was necessary to reform the system. So we've got something that could potentially bankrupt the states as well as the country, and we've got to stop it. We've got to repeal it. If the president won't sign that, we've got to do everything we can to delay
Senate,
and
but I was leading to 2012, and who the I don't know, behind the scenes, as majority leader, you must talk about the chances of a prospective Republican nominee, and it seems to cancel out Romney.
No, I don't think so, Joe. But what I do think is,
Well, who, if then you think Romney or
I'm
then
not
who
saying,
else?
I'm not saying who it is that may emerge, but all I can tell you is that we have a chance as Republicans in the House to demonstrate what effective Republican leadership can be about. Leadership focused on free enterprise, on limiting the scope of government, and getting the fiscal house in order. Because what that does is it creates an environment for growth again in this country. And if we do our job right, we can set up the choice for the electorate in 2012. And there are vastly different views on how we take this country. Obamacare actually is the essence of what I think the opposition's view is about. The Democratic progressive view is much about the government deciding for you what is best, for you in terms of your health care or anything else. I mean, we see it repeated in the regulations that the agencies are about. And we're going to be about focusing on whether it is the NLRB, whether it is the FCC, whether it is the EPA. All these agencies, pick your acronym, are about trying to pick winners and losers, and trying to establish outcomes rather than create opportunity.
Leader Cantor, someone wrote in and said, based, I guess, on my comments about whether this was a step too far in Wisconsin, writing in that the last official poll was the November election. It was black and white. That's the same excuse the Obama administration used when it pushed health care through. Are both sides running the risk of taking a mandate and thinking it is too much of a mandate?
And ignoring polls because polls...
And ignoring polls
yeah,
because polls come
yeah.
through. I mean, the problem may be that there's a big part of the middle of the country that doesn't want to get pushed too far one direction or the other.
Look, Becky, in my view, this last election was about jobs and the economy. It was a rejection of the policies that seemed to think, as Wilbur indicated, from a stimulus standpoint, from a healthcare standpoint, that government was going to provide a lot of the answers. I think there was a rejection of that. There was no necessarily support or mandate of an alternative. So what our job should be is to go about trying to spend people's money the way they would spend it, which demands getting our fiscal house in order,
That's fair.
which is to have some accountability and transparency in everything we do. If we proceed along that line, I think we'll be successful at curing what the electorate wanted, which was a better economy for job creation.
That's fair enough. Leader Cantor, we want to thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Real pleasure.
See you
Great
next
seeing you.
time, Leader.